Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. With the New York Giants having made a head coaching change this week and entering a new era, there's not a whole lot to talk about here on our Friday show. But anyway, I brought in good friend Patricia Traina, and hopefully Patty has brought some things to talk about because I don't know where this is going to go. Patty, how are you?
I'm good, Ed. At least I wasn't sleeping when the news broke, but
I do have to own up to that. I owned up to it when I did
because you
your
said it on
show.
my show.
I know I owned up to it, but I'm old. I'm old,
We
and
know.
yes, we know this. And it was an hour before Brian Daboll's scheduled Monday press conference, and nothing had happened. And I was like, I can take a nap for a half an hour. And I wake up and that hit me in the face that had happened while I was asleep. So, asleep at the wheel. What can I tell you? We still we caught up. We got to it. We got plenty of coverage going, but yeah, my timing wasn't great there.
It
But
happened.
but the Giants always manage to do things. They never do things on our schedule, do they,
No,
Patty?
they don't. During meal times, during when you're getting ready to go to bed.
They
But
never
such
do
is the life.
they never do things when we'd like them to do things. But anyway, Patty, let's talk about what the Giants have done this week. Moving on from head coach Brian Daboll naming Mike Kafka interim head coach, and along the way we'll talk about your reaction and my reaction. But where I want to start, you and I were both in the locker room on Wednesday. We talked to a bunch of players. I want to start with your thoughts on the locker room reaction to the whole situation, because to be honest, the players' reaction and what happens with the players for the next 7 weeks is probably more important than what you and I think at this point. So, what did you think of the mood in the locker room? What did you think of what you heard from players on Wednesday?
And I'm going to go back to when Tom Coughlin resigned. And I remember being in a locker room after that, and there was a lot of guys who were down. Now, I get it. The timing was different. This happened. Coughlin resigned at the end of the season. Dable was fired mid-season. But the mood in the locker room after Coughlin resigned was a lot of down faces. A lot of people were sad. With this latest firing, I did not detect a lot of guys who were sad. Did they have regrets that it happened? Nobody wants to see anybody lose their job. But it was almost different. It was almost like, hey, it's a business, got to carry on, got to move forward. There was almost like no mourning period, if you will. And I don't
Hmm.
know if that's because there was a 48-hour, break in between when the news hit versus when they spoke to the media, or if that's how they really felt. But to me, the guys I spoke with were like, just got to move forward. There just wasn't any sadness like when I had witnessed when Coughlin resigned his position. So, and just to add to that, when Ben McAdoo was fired, when Joe Judge was fired, there was almost a sense of relief when those two guys weren't brought back. I don't want to say that there was a sense of relief that Dable was fired, but it was just a different type of vibe, if you will.
What struck me, Patty, and I'm curious how you react to my saying this. What struck me was, yes, guys, guys said, we feel bad for Dayball and this and that, because you don't like to see anybody lose their job. There wasn't anybody who said this should not have happened. He did not deserve this. There wasn't anybody who stood on that table and said, this is our fault. Brian Daboll didn't deserve this. We did this to Daboll.
Yeah, I mean, I asked a few guys that question. I asked that to Brian Burns, and he said, do I feel that I could have done more? Yes. Everybody
Hmm.
feels they could have done more. The team is 2-8. But, at the end of the day, it's not all on the players. And for them to sit there and say, it's our fault that this happened. Well, were they all put in the best position to make this work? I don't know that they were. I mean, you look at the defense, for example, and I've been saying this, and I know some people disagree with me. That defense is a lot more talented than what it is shown, a lot more. And
Absolutely.
the fact that changes that Dable stayed with the status quo, that he kept Shane Bowen, who is not getting the best out of that defense. You look at some of the other changes that were made on the defense, firing Jerome Henderson and Mike Trier. Was the defensive secondary any better than it was last year? Not really. So just little things like that just kind of added up, and ultimately, it's unfortunate you don't want to see anybody lose a job, but I think this was necessary.
Patty, one of the things, and you, I wasn't really planning to go here, but you kind of ventured into that territory. One of my issues over the last couple of years with Brian Daboll has been lack of player accountability. Um, there were too many instances in my mind of players saying things that could have been interpreted as throwing other players under the bus, players saying things that could have been interpreted as, this is not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. Um, Too many instances of players not doing their jobs or not appearing to give full effort, and not suffering any visible consequence for those things. And for me, the 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 Jerome Henderson thing. Okay, Jerome Henderson did one thing that Brian Daboll hated. Brian Daboll did not like public criticism of players. Jerome Henderson went twice to the media when asked and gave his honest opinion of the effort being given by Deonte Banks. Deonte Banks, to my viewpoint, was never held accountable for any of that, or was never even, no one ever attempted to even hold him accountable other than Jerome Henderson. And the message that a locker room gets when the position coach trying to hold a player accountable gets fired and the player faces no real consequences is, we're not threatened by the head coach. We can do pretty much what we want. There's no consequences here, and there's no accountability. And for me, that's a big part of Brian Daboll's downfall.
Absolutely. Mike Kafka spoke at his introductory presser on Wednesday. He said, he's going to hold guys accountable. He's not going to let things slide. And you have to, it's basic human nature. If you catch, and I know this is maybe not the best analogy, but if you catch your child doing something wrong, are you going to sit and wait and not do anything about it? Or are you going to correct it on the spot? Chances are you're going to correct it on the spot, right? So the fact that, we saw Deonte Banks effort issues and whatnot, and it continued to slide to the point where he ultimately backed Dable into a corner where he had to make a move. Not good. I mean, part of being a head coach is you can't be the player's best buddy, and I think that's maybe where Dable didn't quite grasp that aspect of the job. There were too many times when players have told me where he was just like their buddy as opposed to their coach. And I keep going back to Tom Coughlin because I happen to think Tom Coughlin was one of the best coaches the Giants have ever had, coming from that Parcells tree. What did Coughlin say when he was hired? He talked about having players or holding players accountable, giving them a structure, giving them the necessary discipline, because these are young guys. And I don't know about you, but I know when I was in my early 20s, I thought I had all the answers. And now that I'm older, I won't tell you how much older, but I look back and I say, I didn't know a darn thing.
Yeah, I hear you, Patty, and that's part of it. And let's let's jump to the discussion of the next head coach. Let's kind of skip. We'll go back and we'll talk about this year a little bit, but I'm a believer, Patty, that NFL owners quite often don't know what they should be looking for in a head coach. Okay. What they look for is, oh, this guy's the hot coordinator on on whatever team is doing really, really well right now. So he must have the answers. He must be the guy that we need. He's the hot coordinator on offense, or he's the hot coordinator on defense. And for me, that doesn't matter. What side of the ball you come from doesn't matter. What sort of incredible play caller you are doesn't matter. For me, it's can you lead players? Can you get a room full of, you count the practice squad guys, and you're talking about a room full of 70 alpha male players. You're talking about a coaching staff of a couple dozen alpha male guys. All right. Can you lead this group and get them to buy into your message and get them to follow your program? Can you hold them accountable when they screw up? Are you willing to hold them accountable when you screw up? Are you willing to take them where you want them to go? And I I've heard people say, at this level, at the NFL level, a coach's job is to push players hard enough to get them to be better than even they think they can be. Um, and with all of that said, when you look at the next coach, and it might be Mike Kafka, it might be somebody else. What are you looking for? And maybe just throw some names at us for guys that you might like to see the Giants consider.
When you were describing that, I was thinking of Dan Campbell of Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Campbell is not,
100%.
yeah, he's not really, he's not a defensive coordinator, not a special teams coordinator. I don't believe he's ever been an offensive coordinator, but he's a leader of men, and he's been able to push the team to do, I mean, they made it to the postseason for the first time last year in several years. So that's what kind of popped into my head when you were talking about that. But look, the bottom line is you look at this team and you say, okay, what does it need most? And the Giants, the offense right now is very promising. It has a very promising core. Once they get back a healthy Malik Neighbors and a healthy Cam Scatterboo, and you add in Jackson Dart and Theo Johnson, Tyrone Tracy, Marcus Bowe, Andrew Thomas, and all the rest, you have a solid core there. So that, I don't want to say should be easy to fill, but you get a creative offensive coordinator in here, and they could probably take that offense to the next level. The big problem right now is the defense. You have a group of guys who have talent individually, but you have a situation where that talent hasn't been brought together into a cohesive unit. And that's why I think the Giants will potentially lean towards a defensive minded head coach. That's just my guess right now. Now, who's to say that Mike Kafka won't keep the job? We don't know. I mean, he's going to have a 7-week audition. Maybe he shows enough and they say, you know what, we know him. We like the direction he's taking this team. Make some tweaks on the coaching staff and all's well. Maybe they go that direction. I don't think it will, but you can't rule it out. Do you go with a college coach? If he's had head coaching experience and he has a winning pedigree, I think that's what's important. I think, you look at the last few Giants coaching hires after Coughlin. You've either gotten guys who were first-time head coaches or who were previous head coaches, Pat Shermer coming to mind, but who didn't have that winning pedigree. I think that's what they really need to do. They need to look at this objectively and say, let's bring in a guy who has either been a head coach before, has a winning pedigree, and who can take this team, unite the talent, get the most out of it, and get them to play like a team as opposed to maybe individuals.
Right. I think credibility is a big part of it. Credibility, the winning pedigree, somebody who walks in the door and doesn't have to prove that that what he sells works. Somebody who can say, I've been there, I've done this, not necessarily won Super Bowls, but that's been a winner, that's shown the ability to lead a winning program. That's what I'm hoping for, and it sounds like you and I are on the same page there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important. Look, I had my doubts about this, back when they hired Shane and Daboll. You had a first time GM, you had a first time head coach. And I said, okay, maybe it'll work out, but I would have liked at least one of the two to have been more experienced. And I guess the thinking there was, well, they're coming from Buffalo, which is a winning organization, so they have that winning pedigree. Yeah, but it's a lot different when you're underneath somebody, when you have somebody above you calling the shots. And, I think a lot of us were optimistic that it would work out, and unfortunately it didn't.
I did like, Patty, when Joe Shane and Brian Dable were hired. I did like that Joe Shane basically hired his guy. He hired a guy that he had worked with. He hired a guy that came from, Buffalo, where they had both experienced success. They were on the same page, at least initially. I don't know where their relationship was at the end. They were on the same timeline. And it works sometimes when GMs and head coaches are not on the same timeline. But in general, it seems to be a better idea when those two guys are on the same timeline. And with all of that lead in, let's talk a little bit about Brian Daboll being gone, Joe Shane still being the GM. Um, when we get to, do you like that idea? Do you think that at this point it's justified that Joe still has his job? And there's been some speculation out there that may change eventually. Um, do you think do you think it's the right move for the Giants to go forward with Joe?
I think the jury's out, to be honest with you. I mean, the Giants said in their statement that they released that Joe has assembled a good core young group of talent. And I did a show on this for Locked On Giants. Joe has done better with day three picks than he has with the money picks, first
Mhm.
round and second round and third round. So that's where, you've got to hit those picks.
Right.
And, Evan Neal hasn't worked out. Deontay Banks is on the verge of not working out. The jury is still out on John Michael Schmitz. Some people will argue that Kayvon Thibodeau hasn't reached his pedigree, that really the only picks that, Joe has made in that 1 through 3 round, Jackson Dart, Malik Neighbors. There's
Dave,
even some,
there's an argument to be made there, Patty, that with those two players, there's an argument to be made that it wasn't Joe that banged the table for those two players. There's an argument to be made that it
we'll
was
never know.
Brian Daboll who banged the table for those guys.
Well, I mean, I've heard that as well. But the Giants are never going to say now, who made the pick or
Right.
who banged the table. And Brian Daboll's not here anymore to defend himself, even if he wanted to. I mean, unless he wanted to go independently on a talk show and say, yeah, I was the one that made those picks. But
Brian, you can come on this show. You can come
or Locked
call
On
me.
Giants,
Call me.
yeah.
You can come on this show anytime.
But yeah, I mean, they'll always say that it was an organizational pick, but you and I both know that it is so rare that an organization is that everybody's on board with a specific pick. I mean, Lawrence Taylor back in the day, I think everybody in the Giants organization was like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Don't waste any time. Airmail that card up to the commissioner. But you always have discussion at
Mhm.
every turn. And, you know, that's fine. Healthy debate and healthy discussion is fine. But at the end of the day, you don't want to get into a situation where, say, the GM is overruling the head coach. I mean, we've talked about this when Tom Coughlin was here, how we believe that David Wilson was not necessarily a pick that Tom Coughlin was enthusiastic about. So, we'll never know unless we plant a bug inside the Giants war room exactly what goes on and what discussions and who says what. But it's important that they have the same philosophy as to how to build a team. You can't have a GM that wants to build from the outside in, for example, whereas the head coach is like, no, I want to build from the trenches out.
Right. And we talked about that a lot with Coughlin and Jerry Reese, because I think that as much as both of those guys, were good at their jobs in their own ways, they saw things differently. And I think we ended up with a roster that Jerry may have wanted, and in some ways Tom didn't. And that can be the problem sometimes when you have a head coach and a GM on a different timeline. So we'll see what happens, but you know, I still I get the fact that there are people upset because Joe Sheen made, the mistakes that he's made. No GM's ever going to be perfect. Um, we'll see where it goes. We'll see what the Giants end up with, and I hope we don't end up with a Trent Baalke situation where we have guys saying, "No, I'm not going to come in here until I get my GM." I don't want to see that. So
Yeah.
hopefully, fingers crossed, that doesn't happen.
Well, I mean, what the Giants ownership are going to need to do in order to, erase that possibility, and I know fans are going to disagree with me on this, but they're going to have to give Joe Shane some kind of an extension, whether
Mm-hmm.
it be for 1 or a couple of years or whatever, to show a potential head coaching candidate. No, you don't have to worry. This guy's going to be here with us for at least another year or two. Because
Maybe what?
as I
Yeah.
said,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
as I said with the defensive coordinator thing last year, who was going to pick up their family and uproot and move them to a new state, knowing that there was a possibility that Brian Daboll was on the hot seat and might not last the season? The answer, somebody who was determined to prove themselves or didn't want to give up the idea of being a coordinator,
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's the same thing here, I think.
Absolutely. And, maybe what you do if you give a head coach a 5-year deal, as you said, fans won't like it, but maybe what you do is you give Joe Shane a 4-year extension and put them both on the same timeline, you know. So we'll see what happens there. But Patty, let's talk a little bit about Mike Kafka and changes that can be made over the next 7 weeks. I mean, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't blow up the roster. You can't rip up the playbooks and start from scratch. Um, what small changes can we see from Mike that might help this team, and maybe that we've already begun to see?
Well, accountability is number one. I mean, I'd like to see Mike follow through with that. If somebody's not doing, giving optimal effort, get him out, sit him down, do what you got to do. I mean, we didn't see enough of that under Brian Dable, but from a play perspective, offensively, and you and I talked about this on my show, in the preseason, they ran the screen game pretty well, as I recall. Why not bring that back? Maybe bring up Turbo Miller to the 53-man roster, and now you run the screen game a little bit more than what you have been doing. Another thing Kafka can obviously do is he's got to get it through to Jackson Dart that no, don't be so reckless with yourself. We appreciate the effort and the sentiment, but you're going to get yourself really hurt if you're not careful. So that's got to be driven into his head. Defensively, maybe they run more three or four man fronts than they have, or maybe I don't know, they disguise blitzes and do some other stuff, which I don't think they can because of the back end of the defense. But there's things that Kafka said he likes, and now that he's involved with the meetings with the defensive side of the ball, he can express and say, "Hey, these are some of the things I think will work." And you got to remember something about Mike Kafka. He's a former NFL quarterback.
Mhm.
So, he's, even though he didn't make it as a quarterback in his career, he was on the Eagles. He learned under Andy Reid, went on to coach with Andy Reid, obviously worked with Patrick Mahomes. So Kafka has a pretty good idea of what can confuse an opposing offense from a defensive perspective and vice versa. So, don't underestimate that ability or that trait rather in Kafka.
All right, Patty. The last thing that I really want to talk about is Jackson Dart. Okay, obviously, we know that Jackson Dart was Daboll's guy. We know there was a good relationship. We saw the huge hug between the two of them a few weeks ago when the Giants, I think it was when the Giants beat the Chargers after Dart's first start. We know what they've said about each other. And a lot of the reaction out there in the national media was, well, this can't be the right decision for Jackson Dart because Brian Daboll is his guy and should have been given the opportunity for a couple of years to develop Jackson Dart and all of that. What do you think this does to Jackson Dart, and do you worry at all that this will slow his development, hurt his development, be an adverse thing in his career? Or do you think that you just get the right coach in here, the right offensive coordinator, and it'll be fine?
Door number two. I mean, quite honestly, I get offended when people suggest that Jackson Dart can't make it without Brian Daboll. Give the kid some credit, okay? He's talented. He's a studier. He's a hard worker. Let's give him some credit. Did Daboll maybe, tweak a few things and give him some pointers to help him take his game to the next level? Yes, we'll give credit there as well. But to suggest that Jackson Dart is going to fall apart without Brian Daboll, I just think that's an insult to the kid, to be honest with you. I think if you bring in a really creative offensive coordinator who can get the most out of that kid, who can design plays that accentuate his strengths, why can't he be successful?
Absolutely. The I would agree that the argument that Brian Daboll is the only guy that can coach Jackson Dart is, to me, it's utter nonsense. There's a lot of good offensive minds out there. Now, when you bring in a coaching staff, the Giants are committed to Jackson Dart for the next 4 years. They're all in on Jackson Dart. You do not want to do to Jackson Dart what you did to Daniel Jones with constant changes of head coach, changing the general manager, changing. How many play callers did Daniel Jones go through? How many bad offensive lines did he play in front of? How many rebuilds was he the quarterback for? And that was just a recipe for disaster for Daniel Jones. And you don't want to do that to Jackson Dart. But so what you do need to do is make sure that whoever you bring in buys into Jackson Dart. Whoever
Right.
you bring in understands the kind of player that Jackson Dart is and is all in on developing him, as an offensive coordinator. You want to bring in people who are going to work with what he is and not say, the biggest problem I think with between Ben McAdoo and Eli Manning, for example, when you go all the way back to that, was Ben McAdoo had a way that he wanted to run an offense that really wasn't suited to what Eli Manning was, and that was always uncomfortable. You want to make sure that you bring in people who are on board with Jackson Dart and on board with working with his skill set.
Right, absolutely. I mean, let's look at Daniel Jones. We talked about this again on my show. We talked about how the first year the offense was designed and it played into Daniel Jones's strengths. And then what happened? They moved away from that because they wanted to be more of a vertical offense. And now Daniel Jones goes over to the Colts. And what are the Colts doing? The same type of offense that accentuated his strengths when he was with the Giants that first season under Brian Daboll. Part of the thing of being a good coach is, yes, you come in with your basic philosophies and whatnot, but you have to be flexible to adapt to what you have. It's like being a teacher. You could sit there and say, okay, I'm going to lecture my students and that's how I'm going to teach. Well, not everybody learns from lecturing. Some
Mm-hmm.
people need visual aids, some people need to be hands-on. You need to be able to adapt. And I just don't think, some of the coaches that the Giants have brought in here have adapted to their students, if you will.
Absolutely. Patty, I lied. One last thing. Giants actually have a football game to play on Sunday. They
I
face the
almost
Green Bay
forgot.
Packers. It's funny because I talked to a couple of players in the locker room about that yesterday, and it's like, That's the hardest part of this week is there's so much going on. You know, obviously we're asking them about the coaching change. Their families are asking them about the coaching change. There's all that going on, and they have a game to get ready to play on Sunday. Just the last thing for you. How much are you looking forward to the Jameis Winston experience on Sunday?
Jameis Winston's a national treasure. Let me tell you, I really appreciate what he brings to the table. Not just because he's got that carefree, loose personality, but he's authentic. I really believe that. Now, can he be frustrating to watch when he throws a pick? Yes, absolutely. But here's the big thing that I guess I'm looking for is how did the Giants respond to what has happened? Normally when you make a change, okay, a quarterback change, that's a big thing, but they get used to it. You've got a head coaching change and a quarterback change, albeit it's temporary change. You've got some new things that are going to be implemented. How are the players going to adapt to that? Because look, we're all creatures of habit. And whenever you introduce a huge amount of change that has a big impact on what you do on a daily basis, that can be a little unsettling. So I'm curious to see how the Giants respond to all that.
I'm also curious to see what the stadium looks like on Sunday, Patty. What does it look like? How much green is there in the stadium?
Might be
And what does it sound like? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, at this point, might be a lot because maybe fans have sold their tickets, weeks
Mhm.
ago or whatever.
Mhm.
So, we'll see, obviously, but hopefully Jameis,
Mhm.
he is a treasure, though. He
Yes, he
absolutely
is.
is.
Yes, he
I
is.
mean, have you ever seen a third string quarterback break down the huddle, give the pregame speech before the huddle breaks down on game day? I don't think I've seen that very often.
Nope, nope. He is a unique individual. Patty, I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up. Thank you so much for the time. I will see you in on press row Sunday afternoon. And Giants fans, thank you so much for watching. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.